Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Shi'ite Muslim Iran and Sunni Muslim Saudi Arabia have been at each other for years with a hostile rivalry as both countries seek to achieve regional dominance for both themselves and their Muslim branches. To further discuss their rivalry and the impact it has on the region, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Eran Lerman, who is a senior research associate at the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Eldad Pardo, who is the research director at Impact SE and a lecturer on Iran at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of this deep rivalry that has been going on for more than decades.
It's a rivalry between Shiites and Sunnis, Saudis and Iranians, Arabs and Persians. And indeed, it goes back a long time, but most importantly, for the last decade and a half, ever since the fall of Saddam Hussein, because in this triangle, there has been a third leg, Iraq, which at one time or another threatened both. So separately, they were on the same side in earlier years. But ever since Iraq is no longer a factor in Middle Eastern politics, they are at loggerheads. Saudi Arabia, which used to pay exorbitant sums to terror groups in order to immune itself to terror acts, has now come against the funding of terror by Qatar, which is an ally of Iran, and Iran wants to use Iraq to get a foothold in Syria. It does have a foothold in Lebanon, so Saudi Arabia, which is weaker militarily than Iran, but is probably stronger economically, is now putting itself at the head of the anti-Iran camp in the Arab world.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, first of all, I disagree slightly about Qatar. I think the Qataris are Muslim Brotherhood oriented. They are Turkey's ally, not Iran's ally. In fact, billions of Qatari dollars have gone to people who kill Iran's allies in Syria, and they have gone to the fighting front in Yemen on the anti-Iranian side. This whole Iranian tweet, I think, is an excuse. The Saudis went after the Qataris because, together with the Egyptians, they want to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood camp. They are going to get rid, sooner or later, with the ISIS camp. They want the entire Sunni world, or the moderate forces in the region, unified against Iran, and are not going to tolerate the persistence of a third and fourth camp around them. But the Saudis certainly look at Iran as a revisionist revolutionary force that aims to change the region. The Saudis are let's say, status quo, power par excellence. They like it as it is. Mm-hmm. And for them, the Iranian revolutionary agenda is a threat. It was not quite as acute until a couple of years ago when they realized that the Houthi uprising is actually, as they feared, an ally and an adjunct of the IRGC, etc. There are differences. The Houthis are fivers, the Iranians are 12ers, to those who are familiar with the Shia internal differences. But at the end of the day, we know now that the Houthi uprising looks to the Saudis, for a good reason, as an Iranian dagger pointed directly at Mecca and Medina. This is a point where they start using the one weapon they know really how to use, the spigot, in order to destroy oil prices, bring them down. That skewers the American fracking industry. It's bad for Russia. The Saudis are not going to shed a tear. But the main reason was they wanted to put the Iranians in an inferior position.
Which we'll touch on during this program as well. Dr. Pardo, I'd like to give you the opportunity to give us the Iranian angle on the situation when it comes also to the Saudi-Iranian rivalry.
Well, of course, as we heard, Iran is the anti-status quo, quintessential anti-status quo. It's in the Iranian constitution to spread the religion and to help the weak and the freedom fighters around the world. And we see a consistent Iranian policy since the revolution of 1979. You have the northern axis going all the way to the Mediterranean, and the southern axis, which aims at Mecca and Medina. Once a revolutionary system takes hold of Islam holy places, and of course all the oil and gas that comes with it, then the road is open to unite the peoples of the world within the true religion, which is a combination of Islamism and kind of Marxist populist agenda. The thing is that there are also anti-status quo forces in the Middle East, and also there are also status quo forces in the Middle East, and among the anti-status quo, there are other dreamers. Turkey, for example, ISIS. There are other dreamers who want to have everything for themselves.
Nevertheless, this program will focus on the Iranian-Saudi rivalry, and to do so, Mr. Oren, when we're talking about this rivalry, is it predominantly a religious-based rivalry, or does it have the more national attributes to this rivalry, in which each country has its aspiration to control the economic basin of the Middle East, and also beyond that?
It's national and even ethnic. Because the Persians see themselves as a superior culture, as an ancient empire which underwent many changes, has risen against occupiers, and is now trying to make Persia great again under the revolutionary regime in Iran, while the rulers of Saudi Arabia have been tribal nomads until a century or so ago. And it was only through the grace of the colonial powers that they became a country and a kingdom. Historically, Iran, or earlier Persia, has been the stronger party. And there is, of course, a dispute regarding the name of the body of water separating them. Is it the Persian Gulf or the Arabian? Arabian meaning Saudi Arabian, not necessarily all of Arab, but this is, of course, Arabia. Now, as was mentioned here, the House of Saud is the custodian of two holy places and one holy tenet, Mecca and Medina, and the status quo, which is almost as holy. To the Saudis, they are complacent, they are sitting on huge amounts of oil and money. Perhaps they are not as fluid with cash reserves lately as they used to be, but nevertheless, they want the situation to remain as it is. But there is, within the status quo, there is a change or an evolution in the regime, because we see King Salman and most probably the deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is in charge of defense, but also on other projects. They are changing the outlook, and they are leading a proactive policy for Saudi Arabia.
Which was primarily brought about during the Obama administration, when the Obama administration, or President Barack Obama, was very adamant of securing the agreement to limit Iran's nuclear program between the P5 and plus one in Iran. That happened in July of 2015, but plenty of things happened since then. How do you see this dynamic right now, where the United States, now under its new administration, is seeking to bolster Saudi Arabia and bolster the various forces surrounding it in order to set some kind of a confronting barrier toward the Iranian threat?
Look, first of all, to go back to Obama for a moment, I think it was brewing well before the JCPOA was actually signed. I don't know if you remember, there was a situation where President Obama spoke at American University, and he said, there's only one country in the world which opposes this agreement. And a week later, speaking to Fareed Zakaria, he says, there's only one country in the world which publicly opposes this agreement. Because what he heard in closed quarters, not in public, not in front of Congress, but what he heard from the Saudis was a very loud scream. And the Saudis, in private, had very sharp words. They saw, whether they were justified or not, from their point of view, the American administration was playing an offshore balancing concept in which the Saudis are one side and the Iranians are the other, and the United States is going to place itself where it can, sort of keep a healthy balance instead of remembering that one is an enemy and the other is an ally that did quite a lot over the years to help the United States on a whole range of issues.
It's very interesting to see a public duel via op-ed pieces between the two foreign ministers who both have an American background, Mohammad Jawad Zarif and Adel Jubair, who used to be the ambassador when there was an Iranian-backed assassination attempt on him, and each charging the other and the other government for supporting terrorists. Each has a case, so one cannot referee in that dispute.
Dr. Lerman.
But then the Trump administration comes in. His choices for key positions are the former CEO of Exxon and the former CNC of CENTCOM. Both of them, you could say, are in essence Saudi graduates. They, whether they like the Saudis or not is irrelevant. What they have been doing is managing very large organizations whose mission is to be on good terms with Saudi Arabia. Exxon, cannot thrive otherwise. And CENTCOM, essentially, at the end of the day, is the United States Regional Command dedicated since 1983 to the defense of the Gulf and other areas where the U.S. may need, in between India and the Mediterranean, where the U.S. may need to intervene. But Saudi Arabia is very much at the core. So Mattis and Tillerson, I think, bring this perspective. And for Trump, it's very comfortable because it ties in with his message about jobs and huge Saudi investment.
Was that actually a significant factor to the investment of the $100 billion in purchases from the American defense industry in order to confront Iran?
It's not. It's more than that. I mean, I don't know how much of it is going to actually come to pass. The Saudis have been bringing oil prices down for strategic reasons. It means that sovereign funds are not unlimited. But when you look at the overall package, it's much more than 100 billion. In military terms, let's see. It may not come out to exactly that level of investment, but it's very important for the U.S. and Trump certainly played this card. But in the process, he was there to deliver a one-sided anti-Iranian message that was music in Saudi ears and gave them the sense that there's wind in their sails. They can now come in and break the Qatari resistance to Saudi predominance and unify the camp. They have patched up their differences with Egypt. Just now, the Egyptians have announced that they've come to an agreement. They will give the islands to the Saudis, but they will remain in an administrative position. So that patched up the last. They are unifying the camp of the forces of stability in the region against Iran. And the battle is going to be fought in Syria for contiguity, whether Syria will have Iranian contiguity or anti-Iranian contiguity, north to south, or east to west.
Dr. Pardo, when we're looking at the Iranian rhetoric toward this U.S.-Saudi alliance, of course, it was rekindled following the trip by U.S. President Donald Trump to Riyadh and the conference that he attended there for regional cooperation on combating counterterrorism in general, was also emphasis on standing together in facing the Iranian threat. How do you see the Iranians actually countering this alliance and rekindling alliance, if you will?
Well, I think the Iranians generally do not want to make things worse because the struggle now is at the center. We have ISIS that many believe will not last for long. And here you have a major struggle on the future of Iraq, Syria, and of course you have the Kurdish element that is a big question mark. How all this will develop. The terrorist attack that we've seen at the center of, in Iranian parliament and the Khomeini mausoleum was a huge blow for Iran. It remains to be seen how this this will unfold. But at first, the Iranians attacked the Saudis, but pretty soon they said, no, nothing actually has happened. And it's indeed ISIS. But it's not that simple, because it turns out that there is a lot of collaboration inside Iran, particularly from Kurdish elements. There was a lot of violence in recent years in Kurdistan and also in other places. It's not only Sunnis versus Shiites, it's also Persian center against the periphery. There is a lot of unhappiness with the Iranian regime in Iraq, in southern Lebanon, among the Shiites also, and of course among the Sunnis. And inside Iran, there is a struggle of power among various forces. Actually, the argument that they put forward is that we are only defending ourselves. We are in Syria and Lebanon to defend ourselves, and here you see this terrorism. Had we not been there, we would have seen much more terror inside Iran. But all of this is Iran is not in an ideal, stable situation, particularly because Khamenei, the supreme leader, is very old, and they are kind of oscillating between this imperial dream or changing inside, and they so far the more radical elements have the upper end, but it remains to be seen.
Mr. Oren, when we're looking at two specific fronts, the front in Yemen, where you have a Saudi-led coalition combating the Houthi rebels, which are Iranian-backed rebels, as Dr. Lerman has also specified, as well as this Syrian conflict, which seems to have some kind of turning point where the Assad regime, which is also backed by Iran as well as Iranian-backed militias, sees more and more gains on various fronts. It just last week had the opportunity to gain vital territory on the border region, not far actually from a U.S.-led base where U.S. Special Forces are currently also operating and training forces combating the Islamic State, creating some kind of a land contingency where more and more countries, including Iraq, including Lebanon, have one direct line of the ability to pass weapons, to supply route, which establishes somehow an Iranian dominance in that area as opposed to the Yemeni front where the Saudis are leading. So how do we see those two fronts actually collide with one another pertaining to this ongoing rivalry?
And these are two separate issues. Of course, everything is interconnected, and these are the same countries which have to prioritize and decide what assets to put where. But nevertheless, Yemen is a special case, and it's a case of déjà vu all over again, because in the early 1960s, of course, we saw the Saudis and the British and the Israelis helping the royalist forces against the Nasser-backed revolutionaries of the time, which in a way caused the PDRY to come about. Yemen, of course, was split into two states. Later, they merged again. Yemen is, of course, Saudi Arabia's backyard, the southern entrance to Saudi Arabia, and it is willing to invest a lot of power there, unprecedented power, mostly from the air, also surface-to-surface missiles, because it can have an impact and because it's a vital interest. Syria is a pet project of Saudi Arabia and has always been so in the Arab scheme. Syria and Saudi Arabia had a special relationship, which also had to do with the Saudi-Iraqi relationship. But who can have an impact in Syria? The Americans have a limited impact, the Russians have a limited impact, the Jordanians, the Turks. Saudi Arabia makes its contributions, but it cannot change the situation.
Nevertheless, at the beginning of the Syrian conflict, we saw Saudi Arabia actually establish Jaish al-Islam, the armies of Islam, which were heavily funded and also heavily equipped with Saudi weaponry, which eventually came to the point where they lost the key grounds that they actually were capable of conquering, and at some point they alleviated certain areas and lost that control again to the Assad regime.
Well, the Saudis are not capable of protecting themselves, let alone have a real military impact, and they are trying to work by proxies through funding or arming, but this has a very limited effect.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, that's the question. Is there a third force in the Syrian situation after ISIS is destroyed? Third, because the Kurds and the Syrian Democratic Forces under American support are going to hold the northeast. The regime is going to survive. There's no way that anyone can now see a path to the overthrow of the regime in the rump state. Who will control the space in between, the Sunni space in between? Now that once ISIS is, once Mr. Baghdadi goes through regular Middle Eastern retirement procedures, which involve, having your head sent to Baghdad on a pike, the Saudis would like to build a coalition of forces under their tight control that would manage a Sunni space, maybe in both Syria and Iraq.
Would they be able to implement something like that, considering the Iranian interest in the region?
Well, that means a direct head-on clash. Now, that was there was no question of any capacity to do this without American support. But this is an American administration that is, very explicit at the presidential level about taking the side of Saudi Arabia versus Iran. Now, will this stand up to the test of the struggle for Syria down the road? It could, but that would, I think, could involve some very dangerous situations. It's kind of a little bit like, you remember Fashoda, with the French running east to west and the British running north to south. There has to be a decision point, whether there is a Sunni space blocking Shia-dominated Iraq from Shia-dominated Lebanon, or will there be this arc of Shia dominance, which is very frightening to us, to the Saudis, to the Jordanians, to the forces of stability in the region. That's the test that's coming up.
Dr. Pardo, will the Iranians be willing to advance their course of collision in order to thwart Saudi attempts in hindering its efforts in creating that territory of land that would be under its control?
Of course, they'll do whatever they can. The question is whether they can. That's a big question. So far, great many Iranians died in the battlefield, but not as many as, it's not a big issue for it. It's a pretty large country, Iran, and they can sustain some casualties. But Iran has major decision to make, whether they want to normalize, to open the society economically. And for this, they have to deal with the missile program and with the Middle East policy. And as long as the Americans are clear that the Iranians should, limit themselves to Iran, maybe they can participate, then they don't have so much choice. I think that there are other elements. Iraq, the Iraqis themselves, being Shiites and having all these militias, they still would not like to be under Iranian hegemony. And once ISIS is destroyed, I don't think they will have all the reason to obey the Iranians, and particularly because there is enough evidence that the Iranians, in collaboration with the Turks, were actually encouraging ISIS. They had strong relations also with Al-Qaeda, just like they have with Hamas, and by the way, with Qatar as well. The Muslim Brotherhood and Iran is not definitely. They are not definitely enemies. They are both anti-status quo and all of that. So it's a big question. There is a vacuum there. They are already fighting along the border of Iraq and Syria, involving American
Nevertheless,
units.
the fact of the matter is the Shiite militias backed by Iran were the forces on the ground that made the most impact in order to liberate for Iraq, the various cities that were under the control of ISIL.
I'm not sure. There are the Kurds and the Americans, and actually the Iranians kept themselves outside of Mosul. They didn't do the actual, and these militias did not have the actual impact. And we saw also in Syria, as long as Russia stayed out, the Iranian influence with Hezbollah and Hezbollah really sacrificed. And what were the achievements? Pretty limited.
The Shiite militias are, of course, backed by Iran, but they have their own Iraqi interests. And the main interest for these militias is having the spoils of the liberation of Mosul and other places. They want to make sure that when the oil revenues and other assets are divided, the poor Shiites of Iraq will also get their share, not only the Kurds and the Sunnis. But the Obama policy has been much maligned also around this table. And I would like to put in a good word for him regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. Of course, there is this opposing view, which was also voiced by the Saudis when they talked with Obama, that one should confront the Iranians across a broad front. But Obama chose, wisely, to my mind, to isolate the nuclear issue. Now we have a 10-year window in which it is not
next
a prominent
month, 8 years.
issue,
Yeah.
but and this is the time to contain their subversion, their power projection. They did not change their character or their policy, but it is better to handle these problems when the nuclear issue is currently off the table.
Well, 2 years have passed and 8 years to go, but we have only time to tell what will actually happen. We're drawing near to the end of the program. Dr. Lerman, short analysis on how do you see the near future on this Iranian-Saudi rivalry?
Well, I think Syria is going to become very quickly a focal point. I think the Saudis, if they can keep the camp of stability consolidated, not just Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other key players in the region, with Israel as a member of good standing of this club, even if we are not, overtly registered.
Yeah.
That's our side. And together, I think things can be done to push the Iranians back. I think in Yemen, the Houthis are losing ground very slowly, much slower than the Saudis may have hoped, but they are losing ground. In Syria, a wedge can be driven between the Iranians and the Russians, and telling Assad that being a fully committed Iranian proxy is a dangerous business. And I think that's where you need to go.
Dr. Pardo?
I think the role of the United States is really
Crucial.
pivotal.
Yeah.
They can send the right message to the Iranian population, and even the radicals would like to continue with economic development and openness. And there is a weakness, a leverage point there that should be used to the best of the possibility.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Lerman, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Pardo for coming here today. And I'd like to thank also our viewers, and we'll see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.